Does anyone here bake bread? Do we have any bread bakers? I bake bread. Raise your hand if you bake bread. Anybody bake bread? I know we got to have a few bread bakers. All right. Okay, here's Father Gale. Okay, here's the acid test. Of those people who bake bread, do any of you do this without a recipe? No hands. You know, my grandma Sousa used to bake bread without a recipe. She would bake this most amazing bread for Easter. I do not know what the kingdom of heaven looks like, but I can tell you what the kingdom of heaven smells like. It smells like yeast and cardamom of my grandma's kitchen. That's what that bread would smell like. That's what the kingdom of heaven smells like to me. Have you ever tried to write down a recipe? My mom tried to do this with grandma's bread, right? Because it's an amazing bread. There's no recipe. So she tried to write it down. And if you ever tried to write down a recipe, you know what I'm going to tell you. Because either you write down everything and it gets so long and nobody reads it and they just don't do it, or you have to assume that someone knows what they're doing, right? And so my mom writes this down, and so she asked Grandma, how do you mix this? And she says, well, you mix it to feel. What's that, right? What's it feel like? Well, you have to know how to bake bread. This is what Jesus is saying to us today, right? The laws are just a recipe. But they're not going to save you, right? They'll tell you how to bake the bread if you already know how to bake bread, but they're not going to tell you how to live your life, right? They are the recipe, but you have to know what the kingdom of heaven is like in your heart. Otherwise, you're going to miss out the important things, the things that actually make life good. You'll miss out on the leaven of life. Our first reading from Sirach is trying to teach this exact same thing. It's not about the rules. Not that the rules aren't important, don't get me wrong. But it's about choosing a way of life that leads to the kingdom of heaven. It's a way of life that nurtures, that causes the rules to drop away. We have before us fire and water, the water of the kingdom of heaven or the fire of Gehenna. Which shall we choose? Jesus tells us about how the world is made, right? The rules are about how to live within this world that God has given us. To bake the bread, we must, though, have the yeast of Jesus in our heart. We must have the leaven of the kingdom of heaven within us, or else the recipes, the rules are not going to mean anything at all. So what is the recipe for our heart? Matthew's gospel has many ways of describing it. The shortest version is, love God with all your heart and all your soul and all your might, and love your neighbor as you love God. That's the yeast, the way within us that allows us to live the recipe, the rules of life. To live out this love of God and love of neighbor, we have to have a humbleness of spirit, right? That's what's in the Beatitudes. A hunger and a thirst for righteousness and to speak the truth. With God's leaven within my heart, God's love becomes invisible because now they are within me in love. Do I live that fully? No. The kingdom of heaven is still out there somewhere. I'm not quite there yet. I'm as good as anyone at using the written rules to break the rules of God's love. That's what Jesus was saying about the Pharisees, right? It is easier for me to take the easy road often and to deny the love of God that is within me. To use the examples Jesus used, think about it. How often do you, I know I do this, promise something in friendship or out of fear, knowing that I'll never be able to keep that promise or show up on time when I've promised I'd be there or have a project done or do a favor? It's not really a lie, actually, because it might happen. It might happen. So it's not really a law. It's not breaking the law. It's not a lie. But we know it won't happen, right? It's easier to say yes when I actually mean no and avoid the argument, right? It is easier to say yes than to say no in truth and to find honestly where God's truth will lead me. I recently finished a book by a man named Cale Weston. The book was called Mirror Test. It's a book about Mr. Weston's time as a senior State Department official. He was a civil affairs officer with a Marine battalion stationed in Fallujah, and then later he was in Kandahar. And in those complicated, violent places, too often he found there was too little that he could honestly do. He was repeatedly found himself that he was asked for help by people in the country. And in frustration, he wanted to help them. He really did, but he knew that he couldn't. And so for his own sanity, he came up with this answer. He says, I make few promises, but the ones I make, I keep. That's what Jesus is saying. Say yes when you mean yes and no when you mean no. That has to be a motto for our time. In this culture of hyperinflated stories, claims, insults, or other individuals, things that we say that we really are just exaggerations, it gives us a tolerance for the loss of truth. That's the first victim when we do this. When we find that we no longer are even truthful to ourselves. And so we must say yes when we mean yes, and no when we mean no, and be specific. It's what allows us to live within the peace of our hearts and to have the living water, to have the leaven of the kingdom of heaven. The same could be extended to marriage and to desire, the other examples that Jesus says. Say yes when you mean to love your spouse and to live that love in our heart. It does require a humbleness of spirit and a thirst for truth more than a thirst for lust. You see, when we lust in our heart for another person, we make that person an object, subject to the God of our own weakness. We make that person something other than God's child, our brother and our sister. We truly have sinned against them. Pornography may be the extreme form of it. Viewing it causes us to begin to look at all people as objects, subject to the God of our own desire. To lie is to make our own truth God's truth. To lust is to make all objects subject to the God of our own selfishness. To curse or to be angry is to make ourselves the God of judgment. And a small, brittle, shrunken God we become in our own sinfulness. The leaven of Christ is what gives us the richness. The leaven of Christ is what makes us whole, what makes us worth living. That's what brings us to truth. That's what brings us to honesty. That's why Jesus says, don't wait. Go now, settle the argument with your brother and your sister. Confess the truth to your brother and sister. Forswear your lust immediately. Do not stay away from the bread of life, not even for 1 minute more. Settle immediately. That's what he's telling us, right? If we live that way, Can you smell it? If we live that way, can you smell it? The yeast, the cardamom, the kingdom of heaven? Live that in your heart. That's what becomes the kingdom of heaven. My grandma Susa could bake bread from her heart. We all know these things that Jesus tells us by heart. We could bake this bread of life from our memory with God's love. Why? Because we have been loved by God from the beginning of time. So be the leaven for others, that they might know the kingdom of heaven. Be set free to be joyous in God's truth. Can you smell it? The kingdom of heaven, the leaven that's within you. Live the kingdom of heaven. Don't wait another minute. It's too good to be missed.